Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the final week of the Siege of Vraks, where we are just about to launch the last assault upon the citadel, or at least so everyone involved hoped. And the conditions were good. With the arrival of the Angels of Absolution, the Inquisitor now had another powerful strike force under his command. Granted, this was one that came with a series of conditions for their alliance, but as the Inquisitor was not necessarily happy, but at the very least willing to acquiesce to their requests, they would lend their firepower to the assault, and they would not require much time at all to get ready. Their plans for the assault had been laid down years ago by Supreme Grandmaster Azrael. The less than entirely successful intervention of the Dark Angels previously in the campaign had left a sour taste in the Supreme Grandmaster's mouth, and this attack was originally to be executed by the Dark Angels, but due to them being busy in other areas of the galaxy, they had entrusted this task to the Angels of Absolution. The Dark Angels rarely trust anyone else with their plans or agenda, but the Angels of Absolution were a bit of a unique case. They were one of very few forces within the Imperium that had the Dark Angels' complete and utter trust and confidence. On the downside, this meant that their plans did not really take into consideration what any other Imperial forces might be doing at the time. And so the Lord Inquisitor was put in a rather unusual situation, where he would have to adapt to the plans of others. The first phase of the Angels' plan was for a drop pod assault directly into the large courtyard at the heart of the citadel. This would be presaged by an orbital bombardment by the battle barge Liberatori Delictum, after which Deathstorm drop pods would be dropped directly down into the courtyard, swiftly followed by yet further drop pods containing the Angels of Absolution. Once this force was down, they would head towards the Cardinal Gate, seize it, secure it, and then open it up for an Angels of Absolution armored spearhead heading towards it. Then, together, they would scour the inside of the citadel, defeating any and all resistance, whilst also being on the lookout for Alpha Legion personnel. Honestly, it was a remarkably overconfident plan, bearing in mind it was intended to be carried out once the siege was in its very final moments, but nevertheless still assuming that the Cardinal Gate would be in enemy hands. I think if the Angels of Absolutions had attempted this, whilst the Citadel was still unbreached, they would probably have been slaughtered to the last man, considering the capabilities of the defenders. But luckily for them, the seizing of the Cardinal Gate was no longer necessary, since the Inquisitorial Strike Force had taken command of it after defeating the demonic counterattack. And hell, it might even be tempting to let the Angels of Absolution have a go at the Citadel unaided, just so that they could experience the very same lesson that every other field commander on Vraks had so painfully learned. But luckily for them, Lord Inquisitor Rex was not quite that much of a sadist. Or possibly he was just starting to run out of time himself. Who knows? Nevertheless, after having had a look at the plan, he informed the Angels of Absolution that seizing the gate was no longer necessary. He could guarantee their strike force free passage through it, allowing them to change their objectives slightly. Now the deep strike force would simply hammer down into the courtyard and then expand upon their immediate gains, securing entrance into the Basilica of St. Leonis, whilst their armoured strike force would be able to simply pass through the gate immediately and meet up with the forward elements. Taking further advantage of this plan, the Lord Inquisitor was making sure that he had his own moves ready. First and foremost, the engineer companies, pioneered by Marshal Arnim Kagori, had been working hard throughout the siege of the Citadel, attempting to break into the Undercroft, but due to the enemy's constant and at this point quite expert counter-mining operations, they had been unable to gain much ground. But now, finally, they stood ready to break into the undercrofts, and every single engineer company on Vraks had been redirected and ready to break in. The enemy would be assaulted from above as well as below. And the Angels of Absolution were not the only Astarte strike force that would be making their presence felt. The Red Scorpions would also advance upon the St. Leonis Basilica from their own positions in the St. Leonis Gate. The Red Scorpions had been much reduced after seizing that objective, but they had been reinforced by Death Corps troops. They would hold the St. Leonis Gate and began expanding upon that holding by attacking the various wall positions to the east and the west of the gate, whilst also providing the Red Scorpions with a secure fallback position if they should need it. These troops would also be called upon to provide rearward security for an inquisitorial strike force led personally by Lord Hector Rex, wearing his recently repaired suit of power armor and wielding the mighty sword Arius once again. They would head towards the Priory of the Argent Shroud. Their primary objective would of course be to liberate it and secure yet another entrance into the Basilica of St. Leonis. But as a secondary objective, there was also the possibility that some of the survivors of the Sisters of Battle could still be held within. After securing the Priory, part of the Inquisitorial Strike Force would then move on to the westernmost bastion, the Inner Citadel, where they would be supported by a deep-striking force of Grey Knights, deploying via teleportarum directly into the bastion itself, opening the doors and securing the defenses for the Inquisitorial Strike Force, manned primarily, of course, by the Red Hunters. And, finally, the Death Corps of Siege would not be left out either. After all the blood that the 88s had spilled to finally seize this planet, it was only right that they be involved in the final battle. And so Death Corps elements would support each and every one of the major assaults. In addition, they would sally forth from the Cardinal Gate and the St. Leonis Gate to secure the rest of the Citadel compound. They would also seize the Great Gate from within and open it up to yet further reinforcements. And, obviously, the Titans of Legio Astorum would also be involved. It was a matter of honor for them as much as it was for the 88th to be in at the very end of the campaign, and Legio Volcanum's own god machines were still unaccounted for. It would be less than ideal indeed if this final assault was somehow repulsed by another deployment of the traitor's god machines. But before the attack could be launched, there were preparations to be made, in the form of a good old-fashioned massed barrage. Hopefully the last massed artillery barrage of the war. It was designed both to reduce the various structures inside of the citadel, so far mostly left alone as the guns had focused on the walls, but since those had either been captured or bypassed, they were no longer the artillerists' primary concern. Instead, denying the enemy access to prepared positions and fortified buildings inside of the citadel, that was now their primary objective. And the Basilica of St. Leonis was considered to be one of those fortified objectives. And indeed, the Basilica would be the focal point of the fire missions. It would be reduced to nothing more than a pile of rubble. And in addition to the Death Corps heavy guns, the Angels of Absolution's battle barge would also join in the bombardment. Up until now, the Basilica had been spared of the worst of the shelling, partially due to the fact that nobody really knew what to do with it. No orders had specifically come down to spare it, but then again, no orders had come down to target it either. And there had been a bit of a furor over whether or not it should be protected and seized intact or not. But now the Lord Inquisitor made the firm decision that the Basilica would be treated like any other structure within the Citadel walls, and be destroyed. As a bonus, it would certainly send a rather clear and rude message to certain forces within the Imperium as well. A nice, big middle finger, delivered from what was now considered to be a fairly safe position. Beyond reducing the enemy's buildings, the barrage was also designed to do one further thing. It would guarantee that the enemy's void shields were down. The Grey Knights would be deploying via teleportarum directly into the western bastion, and void shields have been known to interfere with teleportation strikes. Teleporting into an area like that, where the topography was already somewhat unknown, was dangerous at the best of times, but with the void shield up, it would go from dangerous to outright suicidal, even for the advanced and archaic teleportation technology of the Grey Knights. Additionally, whilst void shields usually would be unable to impede the progress of a drop pod, that is very much so a usually kind of statement. If a drop pod was to strike the void shield at a bit of an awkward angle, or perhaps come down at a slant and strike an unusually focused area of the shield, it could be repulsed, or worst case scenario, outright annihilated. And that was not a risk that the Angels of Absolution felt that they needed to take, or were willing to take at all. And so, after yet another lengthy and heavy bombardment that saw even the mighty spires of the St. Leonis Basilica crumble and crash down upon it, the final assault began. The very first forces into action were the Angels of Absolution's deep strike into the main courtyard. Led directly by Interrogator Chaplain Belphegor, the squads quickly disgorged and found themselves in a rubble-strewn hellhole. The bombardment had been, perhaps, overly successful. The ground they were expecting to cover was so reduced and strewn with rubble that it took even the Space Marines a second to orient themselves. But Interrogator Chaplain Belphegor had been studying this plan for years. He knew precisely where to go and had given detailed instructions to all of the various squads involved. Raising his Corosius Arcanum, he pointed towards a partially demolished archway. That had once been the primary entrance into the St. Leonis Basilica, and the place where the enemy's main center of resistance was expected to be, and therefore also probably the expected whereabouts of Lord Arkos. The basilica had been much reduced. Now it was little more than a shell of a building. Here and there, vast pillars could still be seen jutting forth from the ruin-covered ground, and black scorched walls showed where the outer walls had once stood in all their majesty, with spires reaching up to the high heavens above. But despite the comprehensive destruction of the basilica, the enemy, as always, had survived. Very soon, the lead elements of the Angels of Absolution, made up of a squad of Terminator elites of the First Company, were taking fire, with bolter rounds exploding off their tactical dreadnought armor, confirming the presence of the Alpha Legion. A member of the Terminator squad stepped forward and angled his cyclonic missile launcher towards the main gateway, and showered it with high-explosive warheads. This gave the rest of the Angels the time they needed to storm forward. Very soon, the basilica was being broken into either through holes blasted in the exterior or via improvised entrances created via satchel charges and melter bombs. Now inside the basilica, the Angels of Absolution were directly engaged with the enemy. There was indeed Alpha Legionnaires within, but they were already falling back, vanishing into the darkness of the deeper cathedral like wraiths in smoke. The main force of the defenders was made up of a dizzying array of horrifying mutant cultists. Interrogator Chaplain Belphegor strode in through the ruined archway and smote one aside with a swing of his Crozius Arcanum. He blasted another apart with a volley from his bolt pistol. A third mutant hiding in the shadows leapt forward and sprayed the Interrogator Chaplain with a flamethrower. But protected in his power armor, the Chaplain barely noticed. With a display of utter contempt, the Interrogator Chaplain simply advanced straight upon the mutant, who panicked, dropped his flamethrower, and raised a pitted and rusted knife to defend himself. The Crozius Arcanum smashed through it and the mutant's skull with contemptuous ease. Looking around, this scene was repeating itself all across the entrance of the Basilica. The angels were pouring in, butchering the ill-prepared defenders. No wonder the Alpha Legionnaires had faded away the moment the Astartes came close. This was no position to defend. The Basilica had been reduced, and the enemy had had no time with which to improve their positions. A pile of rubble can be a fine fortification, but only if time is granted to actually make it into one. And here, no such luxury had been granted to the enemy. And then, there were the defenders themselves. Belphegor had been on Vraks during the first Dark Angel incursion. He had fought the true defenders of Vraks. And these miserable mongrels were a far cry from the soldiers he had fought then. The Supreme Grandmaster had clearly chosen this moment with expert care. The enemy was all but broken, and all that remained now was mopping them up, whilst ensuring that the chapter gained maximum benefit from it. Of the seizure of the entrance into the Basilica, the first step in that plan had been achieved. The elite vanguard squad would now move into the entrance and stand by near the Interrogator Chaplain. They would be deployed specifically when Lord Arkos was located. They were the best of the Angels of Absolution, led in by their master Ymhrir himself. They would ensure that Lord Arkos was not only neutralized, but captured alive as well. Any other Alpha Legionnaire captured was a good bonus, but it was Arkos that was the true goal in this operation. But before any further advance could be carried out, reinforcements would be required. Even now, the armored spearhead was smashing its way through the hastily erected enemy defenses near the Cardinal Gate and moving towards the Basilica. Once they arrived, the Angels of Absolution would spread out into the Basilica while sealing off every single escape route one by one. And then they would clean out the Basilica and its undercrofts, chamber by chamber, tunnel by tunnel, until there was nowhere left for the enemy to go. And Belphegor did not have to wait long. The armored spearhead was making good progress from the Cardinal Gate against only very limited enemy resistance, which was swept aside by Vindicators and Predator tanks with ease. And behind the Space Marine armor came the Death Corps of Krieg. Guardsmen and grenadiers clearing out the much-reduced buildings still standing on the surface and gaining access into the northern laser defense battery. Once it had been fully conquered, they could expand into the northern wall itself and begin clearing it out once and for all. Once that was secured, further reinforcements could be moved in through the Cardinal Gate, and the rest of the citadel could be pacified, including the Great Gate. Whilst the Astartes and the Inquisitor forces were busy with their own objectives, the Death Corps would seize all of the above-ground structures, or, more likely, the bombed-out ruins. They would also gain access to all of the various entrances into the lower areas and catacombs of the Citadel. Down there, the Death Corps engineers were fighting from the bottom up, and the Corps on the surface would ensure that there would be no escape for the enemies caught down below. And once the surface had been fully secured, the Death Corps would then begin pushing down into the catacombs, slowly squeezing the remaining traitors between two advancing forces. Preferably, at that point, the Astartes would also have completed their own objectives, and so this advance could be led by their power-armored bulk. The kind of close-quarters claustrophobic fighting that was practically inevitable down in those tunnels would be the perfect arena for Space Marines. But first, of course, the ground would have to be actually seized. And whilst the Marines were busy with their own objectives, it would have to be done the good old-fashioned way, with the lasguns and the bayonets of the Death Corps of Krieg. And the enemy was far from done yet. Most of the enemy's mortal defenders had abandoned the surface, recognizing that staying up there meant certain death. With the exception of a handful of desperate cornered individuals and a few traitor legionnaires, it was almost exclusively the haunt of the immaterial servants of the ruinous powers. Demons dancing, gibbering through the wreckage of the citadel, engaging Death Corps guardsmen and the occasional Red Hunter and Scorpion wherever they could find them. These demonic entities appeared with little, if any, warning. Suddenly they could be spewing forth from empty air as small rifts open up for but a handful of seconds, disgorging a dozen or so monstrosities right into the midst of a guardsman squad. 9 out of 10 times, this ended with the complete massacre of the guardsmen, after which the demons would quickly scatter and begin hunting individually throughout the ruins. Slowly but surely, however, they were hunted down and destroyed. The enemy was no longer an organized army, instead simply just bands of roaming demons and crazy worshippers of the chaotic gods. It was slow and painful going, but compared to the taking of the various defensive lines, this was easy. Whenever an enemy center of resistance was located, the Death Corps would surround it and bring in the heavy armor. Lehman Russes, Super Heavies, and Demolishers moving in, crushing the rubble beneath their belts and obliterating the enemy's position. They also began taking steps to counter the sudden appearance of the demons. Squads became mixed in an almost unprecedented fashion, with grenadiers and guardsmen moving side by side with weapons teams. Flamers were particularly valuable, as they could hose down a breach if detected quickly enough, and possibly even prevent the demonic entities from fully exiting, or at the very least ensuring that they had a good sunburn going before they could engage with the guardsmen. Plasma and melter weapons were also highly valued due to their ability to dispatch even the toughest of demonic foes with a single blast. And behind the leading edge of the guardsmen and the grenadiers came various priests and inquisitorial personnel. They would sanctify the ground as they passed, making it very difficult, albeit not entirely impossible, for any further warp rifts to open. It was slow but steady progress for the Death Corps. Meanwhile, as Belphegor was still awaiting his reinforcements, the Red Scorpions moved out from the St. Leonis Gate. Their primary target was the traitor Cardinal's palace. At this point, the Imperials still did not know anything about the fate of the apostate Cardinal, and so they were under the assumption that the most likely place to find him would be within his own heavily fortified palace grounds. And whilst killing him was of dubious strategic importance, as it had long since been assumed that the Chaos Forces would have taken over command of the defense of Vraks, especially with the rather radical change in the nature of the resistance. Nevertheless, capturing or killing the Cardinal would be a powerful propaganda message, and ideally, he would be dragged in front of an imperial tribunal for a long and highly publicized trial, followed by an even more publicized execution. But the Red Scorpions were to be disappointed. Their target had already been executed, quite some while ago in fact, and sadly, not by Imperial authorities. The only things remaining in the Imperial Palace now was what had once been the Cardinal's Guard. They had been captured during the betrayal of the apostate cardinal. Those who had been unwilling to switch sides to the victor had been subjected to various experiments, as they had been handed over to the sanctified. And what remained bore little resemblance to men. A freakish gathering of vile horrors now stalked the halls of the cardinal's palace, and a few of them, those seen to be extra resilient or deserving of special attentions, had even been forcefully possessed by demons, warping their bodies far beyond any human tolerance. And the Red Scorpions, already much reduced from their attack upon the St. Leonis Gate, were not overly interested in getting involved in a brawling match with such beasts. Originally, the plan called for a rapid strike into the heart of the palace, whereupon they would seize the cardinal, presuming he was still there. But upon realizing the nature of their opposition, the Red Scorpions would change their plans. The odds of the cardinal still being here were minuscule, and the casualties inquired in engaging such brutes in a good old-fashioned brawl was not worth the risk that he could be. Instead, the Red Scorpions would utilize the overwhelming firepower of the chapter to clear the palace room by room, in the most literal sense possible. Vindicators and predators would be moved up to blast holes in the palace outer walls. Then the rooms revealed would be scoured by heavy weapons fire both by the tanks and by Devastator squads. Only then would massed squads of tactical marines move in, weapons at the ready, delivering punishing volleys of bolter fire into anything that moved. And once that small segment had been thoroughly cleansed, they would simply move on to the next one and scour it as well. Piece by piece, the palace would be cleansed with overwhelming firepower. It would take the Red Scorpions a full 4 days to clear out the palace, an area not much larger than that captured by the Red Scorpions in their attack upon the St. Leonis Gate. But in return, they would take almost no casualties in doing so. Not all the God Emperor's forces, however, had the luxury of quite that much time. Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex, leading a combined force of inquisitorial stormtroopers and Grey Knights, was racing towards the priory of the Argent Shroud, where it was hoped that maybe, just maybe, some Imperial survivors yet remained. But with the fortress tittering on the brink of defeat, any prisoners that had miraculously survived up until now were not expected to be allowed to live for much longer. Fortunately, the strike force did not run into overmuch of resistance on the route towards the priory. The enemy's organized resistance on the surface had, as mentioned, mostly been shattered or withdrawn. Only a handful of scattered pockets stood against the inquisitorial force, and led by the land raiders of the Grey Knights and their Terminators, they did not delay them for long. Arriving at the priory of the Argent Shroud, they found it still mostly intact, and apparently unguarded. There were no defensive positions outside of the priory, no heavy weapons fire met the strike force, and there were no sign of traitor legion presence. Once the forces entered the priory, however, they did meet at least some resistance. The priory had been turned into some kind of refuse ground. The worshippers of the ruinous powers no doubt enjoying the irony of sullying a temple to the Emperor to such extent. It had become the haunt of chaos spawns, maddened beasts isolated here away from the rest of the defenders, since they could not be controlled. There were hundreds of the vile things infesting the priory, and along with a handful of supposed keepers. Crazed and heavily mutated mortals, but one step away from becoming chaos spawns themselves. They were armed with a hodgepodge of various weaponry, but nothing that could present any real threat to the Grey Knights. who advanced through the halls of the priory, cleansing the various abominations as they came across them, with flamethrowers and blasts of energy from their nemesis Four's halberds. The Lord Inquisitor himself, with the mighty blade Arias, once again glowing with a soft golden light, advanced alongside them, slaying the miserable abominations. And, without even realizing it, one of the Grey Knights, wielding an incinerator, put an end to the miserable existence of Cardinal Zaphon. With his betrayal at the hands of the cornered warlords of Four, the Cardinal had been offered up to the warlord's dark gods. But death was too easy a fate for such a weak and pitiful being. At least so thought Zuffor. And so, instead of simply outright killing him, he would murder him in an entirely different fashion. Zuffor was handed over to the Sanctified for execution, and then transformation into a Chaos Spawn. The writhing mass of tentacles, teeth, and mewling mouths bore no resemblance to the one-time Cardinal whatsoever. The only hint as to the identity of the monstrosity was the remains of a shredded, pearly white cloak, still clinging to its deformed hide. But those shreds were incinerated alongside the rest of the abomination in the cleansing flame of blessed Promethium. Once it became clear that the Red Scorpions did not have the Cardinal in the palace, and that the Angels of Absolution had not captured anyone resembling him either, or at the very least not being willing to talk about it, and there not having been found any other sign of the Cardinal, the Imperium would eventually assume that he had somehow escaped. This would of course not be made public knowledge. As far as the Imperium was ever informed, the Cardinal met his grisly end on Vraks like all the other traitors. And for once, the propaganda was correct, just not quite in the way intended. There was, though, one victory to be gained from the Priory of the Argent Shroud. Having almost given up all hope of finding anything worth salvaging in this God-Emperor-forsaken place, the Lord Inquisitor finally got the message he had been waiting for. Prior Justicar Ophir had located survivors. A group of Sisters of Battle, locked away in the deepest, darkest dungeons of Vraks, had somehow survived for all of these years. They had been down there for 18 years in the almost completely lightless dungeons, subjected to God Emperor only knows what manners of unspeakable tortures and rituals, their minds almost completely shattered. They barely reacted when the Grey Knights broke into the dungeon complex, butchered their captors, and then liberated them. They simply stared ahead blankly, not speaking, reacting, or showing any overt signs of life. If it were not for their helmet readouts and the fact that they were able to stand and walk unaided, the Grey Knights might have thought them corpses. It was good news, of a sort, but hardly the kind of miracle tale that the Inquisitor had possibly been hoping for. When he had come searching for survivors, maybe he had expected to find a saint, an unbowed sister that even after 18 years of captivity was still pure and proud, someone he could parade in front of the army and those who had doubted him in the upper echelons. Somebody he could maybe even use against the Ordo Hereticus. Look at this. This is the brave, pious woman you have made suffer. Because of your inability to act, she had to live through all of these horrors. And miraculously, her mind is intact enough to tell you about them. Well, he could hope, but sadly that was not the reality. The broken remnants of what had once been Battle Sisters would not be of much use to anyone. Even worse, they could be a threat. God Emperor only knew what manners of rituals they could have been exposed to. Even the Sisters of Battle are not incorruptible, and these, in particular, had been put through more than most. Any Imperial Guardsman, hell, any Astartes that had been put through what they had would probably have been executed on the spot for operational security reasons. But the Lord Inquisitor chose to not do so. These were still operatives of the Ordo Hereticus, and there certainly had been some friction between the two of late. Friction that the Lord Inquisitor might not be overly interested in escalating if he could help it. Or at the very least, he would escalate it from a position of strength and security. For now, the Sisters of Battle would be taken from the Citadel as prisoners of war, placed under stern guard and observation, and removed under a veil of utmost secrecy. As far as the rest of the army and the Imperium at large was concerned, at least for now, there had been no survivors. Taking the Priory had taken the full day of fighting, and yet another day would pass as it was fully secured, and then garrisoned by Inquisitorial stormtroopers with strict orders to not allow anyone in without the express permission of the Lord Inquisitor, who was planning one more secretive operation. The Keep, separate from the rest of the Citadel on the westernmost edges. It had once been separated from the rest of the Citadel with a narrow fortified bridge, long since destroyed by artillery shelling. This small separate keep had once housed the Astropath's Sensorium, as well as the most holy Inquisition's officers on Vraks. It also doubled as a holding site for rogue psykers, or those discovered within the population itself, where they would await the arrival of the black ships that would take them to Terra. Of course, the cells had long since been emptied, as the Inquisitor was more than aware of, as rogue psykers had been employed to some effect by the defenders, but due to their unpredictable and highly volatile and unstable nature, they were little more than directed weaponry, released upon the enemy, and then usually they either burned themselves out or, unable to control their powers, overloaded and detonated. The few that had survived for any real period of time had caused considerable problems for the Death Corps, but even psykers are not immune to artillery shelling. And after this many years of warfare, they were all expected to have either been killed or put to different uses by their new masters. The Lord Inquisitor, however, still wanted control over that bastion, because he suspected that it was the remaining strong point of the Chaos Worshippers, and possibly also the location of their vilest rituals. The rest of the Citadel was offering surprisingly little resistance, of an organized sort at least. Lord Hector had expected the traitor legionnaires to fight hard for every meter of soil, and for them to utilize their cultists and whatever Vraxian renegades still remained to their utmost. But instead, the Death Corps was advancing against almost exclusively demonic resistance. In the palace of the Cardinal, the Red Scorpions were engaged with mindless, brutish monsters, rather than Vraxian defenders or traitor legionnaires. And in the Priory of the Argent Shroud, well, again, little in the way of truly organized resistance. As for the Basilica, well, the Angels of Absolution were not overly sharing with information, but judging by the fact that they were apparently making progress and not asking for assistance, the Lord Inquisitor reasoned that they too must have 1. Found what they were looking for, and 2. Not running into overwhelming enemy opposition. That left the Undercrofts, where the Death Corps engineers were fighting even now. And it was by far the area in which the enemy was offering the most resistance. The Undercrofts were a hellish area to fighting even at the best of times. They had been designed specifically to slow down and resist any invader. This was the point from which the Citadel's defenders were supposed to make their final stand. And with the new chaotic nature of said defenders, the twisting, narrow corridors had been made even more horrible, as monsters stalked them in their thousands. Clearly, this was where most of the enemy's abominations had been herded, and the corridors were thronged with vicious, brutish monstrosities. Once, the Vraxian defenders had utilized large mastiffs to control the garrison's slave population. Those already large and vicious beasts had now been mutated into truly horrifying creatures. They were stalking the corridors in vast, ravenous packs, throwing themselves at anything and everything they found. Entire sections of the Undercroft had been sealed off by the defenders and flooded with all kinds of these horrifying creatures, including chaos spawns and those members of the garrison that had mutated far beyond reason. Fighting against seemingly endless swarms of these horrors, the Death Corps engineers were tortuously slowly making gains. Every corridor had to be scoured with autocannon and shotgun fire. Every room had to be filled with poison gas until the creatures within finally choked and died. It took hours to clear even a few dozen meters at a time. It would be a meat grinder to rival anything previously on Vraks, with squad after squad, regiment after regiment, company after company of engineers being fed into the dark and claustrophobic nightmare that was the Undercroft. And even when they managed to clear out the creatures, they then ran into what remained of what had once been the Vraxian Defense Auxiliaries. Vast, mutated ogrins, wielding all kinds of dangerous experimental weaponry, were roaming the corridors, throwing themselves at the Death Corps engineers and reaping a bloody tally as they did so. Years of tunnel warfare had also taught the Vraxians much about booby traps and other improvised defenses. Automatic machine gun posts hooked up to pressure plates down a corridor, or poison gas canisters secured wire tripwires to the walls, or vast industrial cutting tools fastened to spring-loaded arms concealed around corners, ready to spring forth and impale or bifurcate the first unlucky guardsman. And also, beneath the citadel, there was one final store of weaponry. Considered too unreliable and unpredictable to be utilized, and too advanced in nature to be sustained for long in the battlefield above, they had been ignored. But now that there was no more prospect of victory, nor any true prospect of survival, the defenders threw any remaining caution to the wind, and revitalized these ancient weapons that had not seen the light of day for millennia, including a small group of Valdor tank hunters, armed with powerful neutron lasers. Once emplaced, pointing down a corridor, this weapon could scour anything and everything clear in a blinding flash of light, creating areas through which the Death Corps engineers simply could not venture. But many of these weapons proved as dangerous to their wielders as those they were fired towards. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus considered this kind of technology to be lost and unreplicatable. The few Vraxian engineers that had made it this long, well, they could operate a drill, they could perhaps repair a battle tank, and they could certainly maintain some basic equipment, but this was leagues beyond anything they had even attempted to operate before. And so it didn't take long before the various weapons started to break down and in many cases malfunction catastrophically, taking with them both the weapon, its operators, and a few dozen meters of solid rock in every direction. But despite the undoubtedly bloody nature of the underground war, no matter how murderous and horrifying it must have been to the engineers, there was no real mention of traitor legionnaires there either. And so the Lord Inquisitor came to the conclusion that the only remaining center of true enemy resistance must be in the westernmost bastion. And it was also the location where Lord Hector theorized that a warp gate must exist. It was the only explanation for why the enemy could call forth so many demons, and with such relative ease across the battlefield. There was also the arrival of the Bloodthirster to be considered. Such a monster does not simply appear without a great deal of preparation. It also presented a plausible explanation for why so few traitor legionnaires had been encountered. There had been virtually no sign of the Cornet Space Marines, for example. It was entirely possible that if a truly stable warp gate had been created, that it could have been utilized as an escape route of sorts for the traitors. Emphasis on the escape route of sorts, by the way. For whilst the traitor legionnaire may be able to step through a warp gate and possibly end up in a friendlier place than the one he had exited, especially concerning the rather unwelcoming nature of Vraks these days, it was also entirely possible that the Legionnaire's patron entity could find some flaw in his performance, some error or perceived insult perhaps, and thus resign him to the tender mercies of the demonic entities of the warp, or perhaps simply set him adrift on the endless tides of the immaterium for all eternity. As far as escape routes goes, this one was quite the roll of the dice. But considering the alternative was to face down the Grey Knights, the Red Hunters, Red Scorpions, Angels of Absolution, and the 88th Inquisitorial Siege Army, it must have seemed a tempting alternative for many. And of course, as far as the Inquisition was concerned, closing the gate was not merely a matter of denying the enemy a potential escape route, but also one of supreme practicality. If the gate was not shut, then the demons could simply continue to pour through it. And so the next stage of the plan was authorized. The Grey Knights would deploy via teleportarum assault inside the bastion, alongside with members of the Ordo Malus, and of course Lord Hector Rex himself. Together they would delve down into the bastion and close the gate. The Red Hunters and Red Scorpions would not be involved in this operation, at the very least not yet. Only the purest of the God Emperor's servants could be sent towards the portal with any real hope of having them emerge uncorrupted. If it became necessary, then the Asteptus Astartes, or possibly even the Death Corps of Krieg, might have to be deployed, but regardless of whether or not such a formation emerged victorious and able to close the gate, it would have to be destroyed afterwards. And speaking of destruction, there was one traitor force that had not escaped the planet. Whether they had been unable to do so or prevented from doing so, that is an interesting question. But regardless of the answer, the Alpha Legionnaires were still in the Basilica of St. Leonis. And the Angels of Absolution, now fully reinforced with their armored spearhead, were ready to begin winkling them out. The commander of the Angels of Absolution Strike Force, Master Yafrir, would lead the assault into the Basilica, shoulder to shoulder with interrogator Chaplain Belphegor. The entire force was now focused within the Basilica, whilst the battle barge and strike cruiser was off hunting the Aron's Bane. In the rubble of the Basilica, the Angels were engaged in a running skirmish with the Alpha Legionnaires. The Alpha Legion turning every pile of rubble into a miniature stronghold from which to engage the Angels. They were badly outnumbered, but they made the most out of the terrain, hitting hard and then retreating swiftly deeper into the Basilica. But the Angels were relentless. Every time the Alpha Legion struck at them, they would fearlessly counterattack, attempting to bind the enemy into their positions. Every time they encountered an Alpha Legionnaire entrenched in a pile of rubble, they would immediately charge it, reducing the amount of time the Alpha Legionnaire had to make use of his advantageous position. They would then shower it with frag grenades, and after the thuds of their explosion, immediately charge in with chainswords and bolt pistols. Most of the time, all that faced them once they cleared the rubble was a scorched and empty position. But every now and then, an Alpha Legionnaire was not quick enough to retreat and was caught in the blast. Then, swiftly, he was either gunned down, torn to pieces, or subdued and hauled off in captivity. The Alpha Legion was hurting the Angels, badly so at that, but they only had so much ground to surrender. And due to the ferocious aggression of the Angels of Absolution, that ground quickly shrank away to nothing. Within the transept of the Great Basilica, the Alpha Legion gathered for one last stand. Gathering around Lord Arkos, they prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible against the encroaching Astartes. The Angels of Absolution surrounded the transept and prepared to push in simultaneously from all sides. They would make damn sure that there would be no escaping from this. And then, with a crash of bolter fire, they burst into the transept, firing from the hip as they rushed towards the Alpha Legionnaires. They, hidden behind whatever cover they could find, fired back in a desperate act of resistance. Soon the two sides were locked in brutal melee, chainswords and power weapons slashing out against one another, scouring Ceramite armor and mauling battle brothers on both sides. But it was, in truth, an uneven struggle. The Alpha Legionnaires were surrounded, and most of them were wounded and poorly supplied. Their stock in the war had dropped drastically with the arrival of Warlord Zafor and his allies. They did not have a high view of the Alpha Legion at all, and the fact that they had been isolated here, whilst virtually everyone else had been withdrawn to the Bastion for escape, showed just how little value was placed upon them. Lord Arkos had committed a grave mistake when he had not abandoned the war on Vraks when he had the opportunity to do so. Zafor had turned the entire conflict into one of maddened heretical chaos worship, something the Alpha Legion had been studious to avoid. Under their guidance, through the Cardinal, the Vraxian defenders had been a disciplined and organized military force. But with Zafor, they had become little more than bands of maddened mutants. And with the Khorne worshippers aiming for nothing more than wholesale slaughter on both sides, Lord Arkos should have realized that this campaign was as good as over. But for some reason or another, he had not chosen to evacuate on the Aron Spain when the opportunity was still there, before the relief force arrived. And so now he found himself surrounded. His brothers cut down by bolter volleys or clubbed to the floor with chainswords or power weapons, many being dragged off badly wounded, but they would be seen to by the apothecaries of the Angels of Absolution. Hell, the Angels would see to the Alpha Legions wounded before their own, so intent were they to drag them back to the rock and extricate whatever measure of redemption they could from their poor souls. It didn't take long before Lord Arkos and 4 or 5 of his battle brothers standing back to back in a small circle surrounded by Angels of Absolution was all that was left. Still with dark blade in hand, Lord Arkos alone was staring down the muzzles of a dozen or so bolters, and each and every one of his brethren was enjoying the very same scenery. Lord Arkos was coming to appreciate the lesson that had been taught to Lord Commander Jolka, to Marshal Arnim Kagori, to Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex, to High Principe Drauka, to Cardinal Zaphon, and to the Vraksian command staff. Vraks fucks everyone in the end. Resigned to his fate, Lord Arkos took a good look at the angels of absolution in front of him, until he found the one in the most ornate suit of power armor. Then he pointed his dark blade towards Master Yafrir, and with a cry of defiance charged out against him. Meeting the challenge, Yafrir charged towards Lord Arkos, his power sword gripped in both hands, and thrust towards the Alpha Legion Lord. But the thrust was meant to incapacitate, not kill. And reading this, Lord Arkos lightly pivoted slightly off-center, letting the sword streak off his ceramite chestplate and bury itself in his thick shoulder guards. Now out of balance, Master Yafrir stumbled forward, and quick as a snake, the dark blade darted up, striking him in the faceplate, shattering it, and digging deep into the Master's face. Struggling to get away, Yafrir backed away, half-blinded. Arkos shoulder-charged him, sending him yet further off balance, and then, spinning, delivered a second hammer blow with the dark blade straight to Yafrir's torso, tossing him back onto the rubble-strewn ground below. Now, standing over the badly wounded Yafrir, Arkos turned his dark blade against the angels streaming in against him. They were desperate to rescue their leader, and threw themselves against Arkos one by one, also still bound by the order to not kill him. And so Arkos cut them down effortlessly, until a familiar voice broke through the chorus as Interrogator Chaplain Belphegor strode through the throng, closed his arcanum pointed toward the Lord of the Alpha Legion. "Yield," he shouted. "Yield or be destroyed." Arkos simply laughed in contempt. What had he to yield for? Capture? Torture? At the hands of the Dark Angels? Even the Alpha Legion didn't treat their captives quite so cruelly. No, he was going to go down fighting, and hopefully be able to take a few more angels with him. Raising his dark blade in a mock salute, he charged towards the Interrogator Chaplain. But in Belphegor, he would find a very different opponent than Yafrir. The Interrogator Chaplain was not at all worried about taking the Lord of the Alpha Legion alive. He simply trusted that when he hit him, the God Emperor would ensure that he survived. And so, with a titanic two-handed blow, the Crozius Arcanum hammered into the Darkblade. Arkos had already been wounded, and his blocks were weakening. He parried one, then two, then three, then four, as the Crozius rose and slammed into his guard over and over and over again. Sensing that his enemy was weakening, the chaplain pulled back for one overwhelming attack. The Darkblade came up to meet the Crozius for a fifth time, but this time there was not enough strength in it. The blade was battered aside and sent flying out of Lord Arkos's hand. Staggering, the next blow caught him squarely on his helmet, cracking it and shattering the Alpha Legion Lord's face. Then, a second strike to the head sent him sprawling to the ground. Desperately trying to rise, blood streaming into his eyes from cuts across his face, Arkos tried to rise, only to be met by a third dazzling blow straight to the head, once again, smashing his skull into pieces. Belphegor hadn't even attempted to wound him. Not for a single instance did it occur to the Interrogator Chaplain that maybe he shouldn't smash his wounded and downed enemy in the head for a third time. He simply turned to the nearest angel and told him to go find an apothecary, and that this man be kept alive at all costs. Oh, and maybe disarm him as well so I don't have to smash him a fourth time. Unfortunately, in the time it had taken the Interrogator Chaplain to subdue the Alpha Legion Lord, Master Yafrir had passed away. The blood loss inflicted by the dark blade burying itself and shattering the lower portion of his face had overwhelmed even the Astartes' superior internal organs, and he had bled to death. Saying a short prayer over the body of the brave officer, the chaplain then took command of the strike force and deemed the mission of the Angels of Absolution and the Dark Angels on the planet to be completed. They would now exit the battlefield and withdraw. Because, hey, who fucking cares that there was still a war to win, eh? Oh, Dark Angels. Cunts they may be, but they certainly know how to take a prisoner. And speaking of captives, I'm going to hold you guys prisoners for a little bit longer as well. The next episode, we will look at the duel between Liberatori Delictum and the Anarchy's Heart, as well as the Inquisitor's strike upon the last bastion of resistance upon the planet of Vraks, and the end of the siege. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.